this morning we're going to talk about two important and I think practical ideas that became a part of the Unity movement back in the late 1800s, thanks to our co-founder Charles Fillmore. And these ideas, they didn't originate with him, wasn't original thinking on his part. He pulled them together and helped to refine them and then helped to bring them more into the mainstream. And the first idea is something we call the law of mind action, which most of you are familiar with because of this old saying that we find in Unity: thoughts held in mind tend to produce after their own kind, right? And I suppose these days when people hear that, they say, well, duh, you know, everybody knows that. Maybe so. But it wasn't always like that, because for most of human history, people tended to discount the role of mind and consciousness. We gave our power away to magical, supernatural forces, to gods and demons that were responsible for the things that happened, good or bad. Think about the Dark Ages. When I think about the Dark Ages, I think of a time when people weren't supposed to think for themselves. Only the royalty and the religious authorities could make pronouncements about how to live and how the world worked. And all of that was based on these ancient books. And when I say religious authorities, again, I'm not just talking about the Catholic Church. Martin Luther was the leader of the Protestant Reformation, which, well, in my opinion, really didn't reform very much. It was more like a power grab that really did nothing to advance human reason and freedom of thought. As an example, this is what Martin Luther thought about the faculty of reason, human thought, consciousness. He said, "Reason must be diluted, blinded, and destroyed. Faith must trample underfoot all reason, sense, and understanding, and whatever it sees must be put out of sight and know nothing but the Word of God." That's what you call a bad attitude, among other things. And of course, guess how the Word of God was supposed to be discerned. The Word of God was discerned and interpreted by men. They were predominantly men, men like Martin Luther, the Pope, kings, and so on. And this was really a form of oppression that went against human nature and therefore couldn't be sustained, which is why the Dark Ages eventually gave way to the Enlightenment. And here's a high school history class definition of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was an intellectual movement developed mainly in France, Britain, and Germany in the 1700s, which advocated freedom, democracy, and reason as the primary values of society. It started in the 1700s, and then it really blossomed in the 1800s, which means that Charles Fillmore spent his formative years immersed in those developing ideas. And I think that's where he got this new understanding and deep appreciation for the power of human consciousness and the value of the faculty of reason and the power of thought. Here are just a couple of things that he had to say on the subject that I think demonstrate how deeply he valued these things. He said, first thing he said is that humankind is the power of God in action. To humankind is given the greatest power in the universe, the conscious power of thought. And then another thing he said is, the thinking faculty in humankind makes each person a free agent, because it is our creative center. In and through this one power, we establish our consciousness, we build our world. That's really the polar opposite of that quote from Martin Luther that we just heard, right? Martin Luther talked about destroying reason and understanding. 300 years later, Charles Fillmore calls it the highest power in the universe. It's good for the ego, isn't it? I mean, how does that make you feel to think of yourself as the power of God in action, as Charles said? How does it feel to know that your thinking faculty sets you free. And we get the same thing from Buddhism. One of the ancient Buddhist scriptures, the Dhammapada, contains this idea: we are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. Now, that doesn't mean that everything we think turns into physical reality. And I know there are still some unity teachers who say that everything that happens to us is the result of the way that we think. What was it in your consciousness that caused that to happen in your life? And the evidence overwhelmingly proves that this is simply not true. You know, there are people, some of them Karen and I know personally, who are obsessively afraid of tornadoes and earthquakes and things like that. And they live and die without ever experiencing a tornado or earthquake, despite the fact that they are obsessively thinking about those things. Their thoughts held in mind did not produce tornadoes and earthquakes. Of course, I guess you could always say, well, it produced it for other people, but it didn't happen in their lives. It doesn't work that way. You know, the principle is that thoughts held in mind tend to produce after their own kind. We sometimes see the word tend missing from that quote. And most of the time, 99.9% of the time, we experience the results of our thoughts at the level of consciousness. In other words, we experience them internally rather than out there in the physical world. So, fearful thoughts about tornadoes, earthquakes, terrorism, and other things will definitely and absolutely produce one thing for sure and for certain every single time. And you know what that is? Fear. Fearful thoughts are going to produce sensations of fear. You will live in a fear-based consciousness, and that brings its own special kind of hell, doesn't it? At that level of consciousness, we're actually experiencing a form of attack and destruction. You know, hell isn't something in the afterlife. It's something that we can live in right now if we want to. We get to choose. Here's another little gem from some ancient scriptures, this time Hindu scriptures, the Bhagavad Gita. For him who has conquered the mind is the best of friends. But for one who has failed to do so, his mind will remain the greatest enemy. Indeed. So I think you can appreciate why I chose this topic at this particular time in human history, because we're sharing this, call it a global experience, and it's going to take human creativity and reason and thought and consciousness to deal with it. Whether we want to give credit to creator or natural selection, the solution will come from human consciousness. And even if we're not directly involved in the search for a vaccine or some other medication that might mitigate the virus, we're still going to be responsible for what we create in our own immediate environment. The law of mind action, here's another little spin on it. The law of mind action means that the things we consistently allow to occupy the mind, especially when they're supported by strong feelings, will tend to show up in our lives. And first and foremost, they show up at the level of consciousness. And from there, it's just a very short jump to showing up in the body as feelings and emotions and eventually actions and words that we speak out there. If I go around habitually thinking about the world as a hostile and unfriendly place, where it's dog eat dog, survival of the fittest, and the deck is stacked against me and everyone else, do you think I might experience some fear, some anger, some anxiety? Do you think that I might come across to other people as fearful and perhaps angry and anxious, perhaps as someone that maybe people don't want to be around? And what's it doing to me at a gut level when that's happening? It can be emotionally draining, physically tiring. It certainly would have a negative impact on my relationships, as I look over at Karen and she nods her head. And in some cases, that kind of stress and anxiety can cause some types of physical illness. So this is where we need to look at a second idea that Charles Fillmore adapted for unity. This comes from the 12 powers. One power in particular, which is power. Charles Fillmore defined power as dominion or mastery. Dominion or mastery. He said, "The mind and body of man have the power of transforming energy from one plane of consciousness to another. This is the power and dominion implanted in man from the beginning. The power faculty plays an important part in controlling the expression of the many emotions, inspirations, and thoughts." So it's our power of expression as well as our power of self-control. They go together, expression and self-control. So it's our ability to take our thoughts and ideas from the realm of the abstract and put them out into the tangible world in such a way that they can accomplish something. My thoughts could eventually turn into a vaccine. That's how it's going to work. They can be made real, or we might say realized. That's the expression part of power. The other part, which tends to get lost in the shuffle sometimes, is the part that's called self-control. Developing a moment-to-moment awareness of what's going on in consciousness. What variety of thoughts are we habitually entertaining? A lot of people have no idea how often they're going over a particular variety or type of talk. How often they arise spontaneously. We're not aware of them, and we just let them hang around and dominate our inner dialogue. So dominion and mastery means that we're in conscious control of our words and actions because we're first and foremost in control of the thoughts and the feelings and the emotions that are always behind the words and actions. Sometimes I hear people say that they admire someone because, by golly, they tell it like it is. And what I'm usually hearing is that the person doesn't exercise much in the way of dominion or mastery at the level of thought. Whatever thought, feeling, or emotion might be bubbling beneath the surface gets to take control of behavior and speech, and out it comes every time. Now, some people call that being authentic. I would call it a lack of self-control and a lack of self-awareness. You know, I find it interesting that we go to a lot of trouble to train our pets, especially our dogs, to control their natural instincts, right? But we don't put that same emphasis on people. We tend to let them off the hook, especially when they become adults, when they should know better. We train our dogs to control their natural instincts, and in some cases, I think they do a better job of it than a lot of human beings. I got this picture up here that I think kind of illustrates the point. If you can't see it very well, it shows a line of German Shepherds. They are police dogs in training, and the caption says, "The final test of police dogs, self-control." The dogs are all off-leash, and there is a cat walking in front of this line of German Shepherds, and they're just sitting there looking at it. And incidentally, this is a good time to remind you that if these quotes and pictures don't come across quite as well on the live stream, go to our website, our homepage. They are included in the blog entry that is up for today. All the pictures, all the quotes are there so you can see them clearly. So yeah, we train our dogs that way. Of course, the cat is another story, but I saw something interesting about cats here. Stay home, practice social distancing, wash your paws often. Oh my God, we're all becoming cats. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I know we have a lot of cat lovers in the group as well. But although I do notice that our poodle Annie, she washes her paws like a cat. So I guess it's not exclusive to cats. But anyway, I digress. So when it comes to learning how to have better dominion and mastery over our thoughts and instincts, I'm sure that everyone knows what the best tool is for that. The best tool that we have in our spiritual toolbox to help to learn how to have mastery and dominion over our thoughts and instincts is some kind of practice of meditation, some form of mindfulness meditation, learning how to observe our thoughts, our emotions, our sensations as they arise, and most importantly, before they take the form of words and action. I've done a lot of meditation classes over the years, and the comment I hear most often in the early stages is someone saying something to the effect of, I can't believe all the thoughts that are running through my head. I can't stop them. I keep thinking, and so on and so forth, to which I reply, congratulations, because you're seeing something that most people who don't practice this, they have no idea that that's going on. Now you're seeing it. You're seeing what's going on in the background at the level of consciousness, all the thoughts, the emotions, the running commentary, the storytelling, and all that kind of stuff. And the purpose of meditation is not to stop thinking. The purpose is to see that we are constantly processing and commenting on the contents of consciousness. That's a huge step in learning meditation, is seeing that and accepting it. So I'm going to conclude this morning with a meditation technique that's probably been around for about 15 years now. I did some research. I couldn't find any one person who gets credit for this. It seems to come from a group of Vipassana teachers, the Vipassana community, or as it's probably more well known over in this country as the Insight meditation community. And it starts with an acronym that's really easy to remember. The acronym is RAIN, as in water from the sky. And this is what it stands for. It stands for recognize, accept, investigate, and non-identification. This practice, this form of practice, works well with anything that arises in our awareness during meditation, but they find that it's especially helpful for the negative stuff that might come up. So if we have thoughts of fear, sadness, whatever it might be, it's especially helpful for dealing with those kind of things. So we have an expanded version of this again in the notes on our blog, but just to go through it here this morning, recognize means we see it. We first realize that it's there. We recognize it, and we move in closer to the feelings, the sensations, the thoughts, and we notice how we are reacting. And we especially notice how they're showing up physically in the body. If there's a physical component, we want to get down to that as well. We stop and we observe, and we let go of the reaction. We stop reacting. We simply recognize, observe. Sometimes it's helpful to label what we're experiencing without commentary or without telling a story about it. So recognize. Then we accept, which means we simply let it be. We relax, let go, release, surrender. We let it be without trying to change it. And this is where we want to be especially careful to notice when we're criticizing ourselves for having a particular thought, feeling, or emotion. When we're criticizing ourselves, when we're thinking thoughts that, oh, I'm weak, or I'm unspiritual, or whatever form you choose for beating yourself up, we want to stop that. Notice it, stop it, and replace any sense of self-criticism for these things with a form of non-judgmental, accepting compassion. Investigate. That means we get curious. We go deeper. We really explore and we ask questions like, what does this want from me? What does this do for me? How is it affecting me? A couple of weeks ago I gave you a link to various guided meditations by a Buddhist teacher, an insight meditation teacher named Jack Kornfield, and one of the things that he talks about when the emotion of fear arises is he says, make friends with it. It's trying to do something for you. It may feel negative, but in some ways it's trying to protect you. And he simply says sometimes it's helpful to say thank you. Thank you for doing that. You've done your job. And then you can move on. That's an interesting way of dealing with it. And I think that would work well with some of the other things that arise. So we investigate. We get curious. And finally, this last step, non-identification, which probably is the more difficult of the four steps. But non-identification means that we simply rest in our natural awareness of this instead of identifying with it. Instead of thinking that, that I am afraid, we simply notice that it's a feeling, or it's a sensation, or it's a thought which is just as temporary and fleeting as any sensation, feeling, or thought. It's not something that is an integral part of who we are. We can learn through this process that we can have a feeling or a thought, but it's not who we are. So again, there's a more detailed and expanded outline of this technique in the blog section on the main page of our website, www.unityofauburn.com. And there are plenty of other resources online. If you just do a search for RAIN, Buddhist practice, you'll find a lot of different, I think there are some guided meditations and lots of interesting articles on that topic. So again, this is some good practical stuff that's a part of our principles in unity that I think are especially useful. And that's all for today. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you on Facebook again next week.